Night settles like a soft curtain, and somewhere far off, a lone owl measures the dark with slow notes. The fire is low, just the quiet stitch of coals threading through the air. Tents breathe in and out with the breeze. A storyteller, unseen, invites listeners to draw their blankets close and let the day's noise drift away. He speaks of 8 true accounts whispered over trailheads and picnic tables, retold on porches after long drives home, stories that were carried out of the woods by people who still find pine needles in the folds of their jackets. He promises they are gentle enough for sleep, yet tuned to the hush between heartbeats, where the forest's old patience can be felt. Those who stay to the end will hear how stillness itself can lean nearer, how small decisions along a fire road or creek bed can feel like stepping from one world into another. So, settle in. The zipper teeth shine like little stars. Embers sigh. The ground is cool and sure beneath the sleeping pad. Tonight, the dark doesn't hurry. It waits. And it listens. And it remembers. Story number 1. It began with wet grass and a lakeshore that held the morning like a glass bowl. 2 graduate students, Lena and Marcus, had pitched their small tent on a knoll above a high country lake as thin fog drifted and opened. Their trek in had been ordinary, the kind of walk where the weight of a pack becomes a rhythm, and the rhythm becomes thoughts that arrive and leave like birds. Night brought no storms. Somewhere around midnight, a loon called, and the sound trembled through the cool air. When dawn arrived, with that first pale wash that reveals footprints and overlooked pine cones, they noticed the dew. It was the way the dew had been wiped away that made them pause. Around their tent, there was a faint arc, not a full circle, just a curve like the edge of a saucer pressed lightly into the grass. The dew along that arc was thin, as if something had passed without sinking, without compressing the soil. Marcus crouched, rubbed his thumb along a blade. Not trampled, just dry. He joked about deer nosing the ground. He counted off possibilities while Lena boiled coffee over their small stove. As the sun climbed and warmed their sleeves, the curve faded, and the talk moved on to the day's route. They stayed a second night because the water was so clear. The stones seemed afloat, because the ridge to the west caught the evening light and held it, and because sometimes a campsite simply asks 2 people to stay and be quiet a little longer. The second morning, Lena unzipped the tent and went still. The arc was larger. It had become 2 arcs, like the marks a compass draws when someone is practicing circles on stiff paper. This time, along the outermost curve, there were marks. Not prints depth-wise, but changes in texture, the dew disturbed in a heel-to-toe pattern like someone slowly, carefully, had walked in measured steps, as if counting. They didn't say anything loud. It didn't feel like a subject for volume. Coffee again, quiet again. And each watched the other to see if the unease was reflected. It was. In mid-morning, they took a little walk around the shore and noticed that from certain angles the dew tracks took on a clock's logic. 1 arc near where 9 would be, 1 near 11. It was nothing so precise that a picture could prove it, just a suggestion that a direction had been checked off, and then another. They told themselves the 3rd night would be the last. They set a few simple safeguards, not dramatic. Just the kind of things people do to feel in conversation with their surroundings. Marcus sprinkled a thin line of flour at ankle height along a few patches of grass where the dew had been touched before. Lena tied a small bell from her pack no bigger than a thimble on a string near the tent door, so light a breath could stir it. They zipped the tent and lay awake at the beginning, listening to the familiar chorus as it shifted deeper into night. Wind in the evergreens, soft pushes and pulls as the lake found its own version of sleep. At a time past midnight, when numbers don't stamp themselves so hard into the mind, the bell offered one gentle note. Not a clang, not an urgent chime. A single bright dot in the dark. They didn't move. There were no heavy steps, no shadow dragging a zipper. Just a sense of presence outside, neither close nor far. If they held their breath, the tense nylon responded like a listening ear. 10 quiet minutes later, a soft brush of wind pushed against the tent wall and then eased away. When Marcus blinked into the light of a headlamp, hooded in a hat to make it dim, Lena caught his eye and nodded. The bell stayed still. The lake made its small, patient sounds, morning, silver, and then gold. The arcs were 3 now. The flour had puffed into small ghosts here and there, smudges blown by a breeze that had never seemed strong enough. No crisp heel and toe captured in a court evidence way, just an absence where damp should be, a path that kept its shape better when you didn't look right at it. The map on their phone, downloaded before their signal vanished, showed their clearing and the contour of the shore. Lena laughed too softly for laughter when she laid her wristwatch against the map and saw a kind of rhyme. Not perfect, not precise, but it was enough to convince them to be gone before the ark might reach the point nearest the tent door when midnight came. They packed mid-afternoon, slow and neat. They left the site as they had found it, brushed away the flour, removed the bell, scattered their fire-ring stones back into anonymity. The lake looked as if it had never noticed them. As they crossed the meadow, dew gathered again at the tips of grass. Their footprints, for the first time, looked deeper. They felt that sensation a person has when they've spoken unintentionally in a library, eyes on the back of the neck without there being any eyes. At the edge of the trees, Marcus turned. It wasn't fear, not exactly. The kind of looking back a person does at a place that is still writing something without ink. From the angle of the path, he saw the arcs as a whole. The curve nearest their tent site was indeed positioned roughly where 12 might be, and across that same large curve, not yet rounded into completion, there ran a thin new line like a second hand marking a moment. The line pointed away from the lake. It pointed toward the trail. On the drive out, forest road giving way to paved road to highway, rest stops and gas stations lifting them back into a world with receipts and hand dryers, they felt relief. They also felt watched in the way people feel watched by what they don't understand. That night, in town, they met a ranger for a volunteer training someone had signed them up for months before they knew they'd be camping. The ranger was kind. When Lena, in a careful tone that tried to be more amused than unsettled, mentioned the dew patterns, the ranger nodded, as if someone had described the weather. "I've heard of that," he said, pouring coffee. He did not condescend. He did not add more. He only said, "There are places where the ground memorizes, where the night has habits." Lena asked if others had taken pictures. He said he'd seen some, but that cameras have a way of flattening things that work on the edge of seeing. Marcus looked out the window, as if the lake might be there behind the parking lot. He decided, with a sudden tenderness, that the place belonged better to the lake than to any photo they could have framed. A week later, a message arrived from a friend who'd said, when told about it, that he had once camped on that same knoll. The message was a blurry shot of dawn dew on grass, arcs faint as whisper marks, with the timestamp cropped so that only the date, the time during sunrise, and a corner of a tent stake could be seen. The caption read, "We left before midnight like you did, and that was the truth of it. No chase, no doors slammed, only the sensation that certain clearings are clocks without hands until people put their tents there, and then the ground remembers a pattern, and then the night, patient as ever, turns once more." Story number 2. On the north shore of a long, quiet reservoir, a solo camper named Jonah slid his kayak onto pebbles that clicked against one another like very small teeth. His plan was simple: paddle, camp, paddle. The kind of plan that leaves a person pleasantly empty of context. He brought a pocket radio, partly for weather updates and partly because he liked the way certain stations sounded far out from town, voices coming thinly through sky, like a wind happening somewhere above the trees. He set his tent in a stand of birch, pale trunks going upward as if they might decide to lift. The afternoon was mild, and blue damselflies stitched seams near the water's edge. He cooked something from a small bag, stacking stones around his stove to block the breeze. The radio, propped on a log, whispered static when he turned the dial. A clear voice appeared for a moment, gave a temperature, then drifted away. He was not expecting company. It felt good to be one figure moving through a big, bright landscape. After sunset, fog began to insinuate itself across the water, not thick, more like milk poured in someone else's cup. Jonah zipped into his tent and listened to the small sounds of settling. It was a place where a person's heartbeat seems larger than usual, and every small crackle from the birch leaves had a beginning and an end he could track. He turned on the radio, more to be reminded of other humans than to learn anything specific. He landed on a station he didn't remember tuning before, an old frequency number he'd seen on a weather map years ago. "Evening advisory," the voice said, calm and practiced. "Reservoir ridge pockets, developing fog. Shoreline temperatures falling. If you're in the birch, Stand near the north. Finger. Bring your gear. 2 Street is inland. Jonah lay still. He hadn't told anyone where he was camping. He listened for the small self-importance that sometimes clings to coincidence. But the voice did not sound like a coincidence trying to impress him. It sounded like routine. Shoreline temperatures falling. 2 strides inland. He unzipped the tent, and in his socks, lifted the stakes one by one, pulled the tent with his sleeping bag still inside a short distance nearer the trees. It was no trouble. He placed the stove and bear can beneath a low branch, habit and care pairing like fingers lacing. A few minutes later, fog arrived in earnest. It came so softly it seemed to have nothing to do with danger. He could see only a few yards toward the water, and in that few yards the pebbles darkened as damp gathered. From somewhere mid-lake came a hollow tap, the sound of something wooden echoing against itself. For a moment he thought of his kayak, pulled well above the shore but still drawn by the idea of sliding. He checked. The boat sat obediently where he'd left it. He brought the radio close and turned the volume down, so it felt less like a broadcast and more like a voice at a campfire. North Finger, the voice said again, as if continuing a thought. Fog walls moving 5, then 3. Stand clear of the waterline. This is Station Greencap. Copy? Jonah did not have a transmitter. He whispered anyway, out of courtesy. Copy. He was surprised by how relieved he felt to be told simple things to do. The voice did not comment. The fog drew an edge near his toes. It lifted the smell of the reservoir in a damp breath that seemed old and not unfriendly. An hour passed, small and slow. He clicked the radio off, then on again. Other voices came and went. One describing a county road closure. Another advising boaters about a marina buoy replacement. He half slept with the radio against his chest, a habit from childhood naps, the soft static like being told a story that never finishes. At a time that felt like the middle, but might have been only a sliver past it, the lake made a sound that wasn't its usual sound. A kind of shiver at the surface. A lot of tiny movements disguised as one. It made the birches pause, or perhaps it made Jonah think they had paused. He held the radio again and turned the dial, slowly. The voice was there, as if waiting in a hallway. Greencap repeater, it said. Jonah, do not respond. Break camp at first light and exit by ridge trail toward the east lot. Fog will lift late. Copy? Do not respond. He laughed a little at the order, but not unkindly. The radio gave a small squeal where 2 signals tried to share a door. He clicked it off and placed it beside his boot, heart steadier than might be expected. Dawn, when it came, took keys out of the fog's pocket and unlocked the shapes one by one. Boats appeared, then the other shore, then texture in the birch bark as if someone had turned on the lamp in a room and all the corners caught up. He packed as instructed and pushed the kayak to the water as quietly as he could, because there is a way to put a boat in that feels respectful of what wakes up along shorelines. About halfway to the east trail, with the paddle pulling the lake along as if he were comforting it, he looked up at the ridge that held the trail. A figure stood at the break in trees, not dramatic, not waving both arms in spectacle, just there, with one hand lifted like someone who sees a friend across a street and wants to say, without drawing attention, that it is good to see them. It wasn't close enough for details. The outline could have been that of any ranger wearing a hat and a jacket. The fog pulled back like a curtain, obliged to run on schedule. Jonah lifted his paddle in return. The figure lowered its hand, turned with the easy certainty of someone who knows where the path goes, and vanished sideways into trees. At the east lot, 2 trucks sat early and square. There was a small ranger station with a porch that made the morning feel like it had been designed for porches. Inside, a ranger grinned over a brochure rack and poured coffee with the unhurried niceness of someone who likes to be the first voice a traveler hears on a new day. They chatted about water levels, fire restrictions, where the spring came to the surface if you wanted sweet cold in your bottle. When Jonah, feeling slightly foolish but compelled to say it, mentioned the station he'd tuned in Greencap, or something like it, the ranger's smile drew into a shape people wear when they recognize an old tune. That repeater was shut down years ago, he said. Budget, storms, fill in your favorite reason. People still pick it up sometimes. It's strange. We've heard reports since before my time. It mostly does what you heard. Weather calls, polite instructions. I haven't known it to be wrong. Does it know names? Jonah asked, only then understanding how deeply he'd accepted the voice's quiet familiarity. The ranger considered. It's a small lake, he said, letting the question turn over once in his mind. Word travels funny out here. On the drive out, the radio in Jonah's car caught nothing unusual. Music, news, the kind of road talk that lays itself in front of you so you don't fall asleep. But at one bend between pines, the speakers picked up a sliver of the old tone, like hearing someone clear their throat before speaking. He tapped the volume, keeping his eyes on the painted line. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the signal paired through. Green cap clear, the voice said, so faint he could have missed it. Return what you borrowed. Have a day. He smiled without deciding to, and an answer formed on its own. He would return the borrowed listening. He would put it back where he found it by the water, in the fog, in the quiet shape of obedience to a voice that asked very little. That night at home, he placed the little pocket radio on the windowsill and left it turned off, as if the world might call him anyway. The next week, he mailed a small donation to the park's volunteer fund. A month later, a friend sent a picture taken from that same ridge. Fog like folded paper. A single figure resolved at the break in the trees, arm raised in a gesture both practical and kind. It could have been anyone. It could have been no one at all. The lake would be there regardless, like a conversation that waits whenever you need to step back in. Story number 3. In the Red Rock country where sunlight feels like a second currency, 4 friends sought the hush of a canyon that braided itself through stone, as if it had been practicing for a very long time. They had planned well. Maps marked, water cached. They carried a small lantern, not for necessity but for the comfort that a circle of steady light can give when a cliff seems to lean a little nearer than is strictly polite. On the second afternoon, a cloud shelf rolled in from nowhere and set the canyon's palette to deeper reds and sudden shadows. Their daylight grew short faster than they had expected. Walls that had glowed like embers now felt cool to the touch. They made the kind of decision that's sensible in theory and heart rate elevating in practice. Press on to a flat bench they'd seen on the map, just half a mile further, rather than sleep in a slot that would feel like a pocket. At the junction of a side wash, where cottonwoods lifted green like a surprise, they saw him, an older man, or perhaps just a man whose stillness made him seem older than he might have been. He sat on a sandstone shelf with a small canvas bag at his side and a lantern on the ground near his boot. The lantern was brass, simple, with a glass globe that had been polished until it seemed to contain a small dawn. The man glanced at them without measuring their worth. He stood and lifted the lantern with a tender familiarity. "Bench feels shorter with this," he said, voice even. He held it toward them with a generosity that did not preen. "Return it in the morning where the canyon first turns. You'll see a white rock that looks like a baking loaf. Place it there." One of the 4, Eliza, reached for the handle. They found themselves saying thank you in various shapes that all felt too small for the kindness. The man nodded in a way that accepted gratitude while waving away any idea of debt. He did not ask their names. He did not give his. He returned to his spot on the sandstone, then stood again. Then this is what they would wonder later seemed to be less present than he had, as if the changing light had decided not to keep track of him. They resumed with the lantern held low. Its flame did not flicker. Even in a breeze that tiffed like a cat along the narrowest bend, the light did not refuse its duties or draw strange shapes on the wall. When they faced a decision left through a darker slot where the sand drank sound, or right along a gentler ramp where striations in the rock stepped like stairs, the lantern tested their choice. Step toward the wrong path, and the light thinned to a pale coin. Step back toward the right path, and the lantern deepened, full and friendly again. It was not magic in a way that asked to be applauded. It was simply useful in a way that felt like being accompanied by someone who had walked this route many times with no need to talk about it. They reached the bench with the last light of day's day. The wind made a slow seam across the top of the cliff. They ate, reluctant to disturb the quiet with the rustle of their bags. When they set the lantern down, it cast a circle that claimed their small square of world and let everything else be quietly on pause. Eliza, who was a person who loved to fix small things, disassembled and polished the lantern without disassembling it, if such a thing is possible. She wiped a smudge here, checked a wick there, an act the others watched with that keenness people can have at camp, how hands move, how tools are treated. The lantern glowed at a level that made it a companion rather than a spotlight. Night was early, as it can be among walls that make their own sunsets. Stars formed an arch, like an old stone bridge. Around midnight, a coyote's single syllable unrolled and folded again with elegance. No one had bad dreams. The ground, uneven but true, gave their shoulders just enough complaint to remind them they were not at home. They slept in a way that felt respectful to the place. The morning came not like a switch, but like a small, shy animal deciding to draw nearer. They ate quietly, left no sweet smell that might signal to busy little lives to come inspect their waste. They packed as if they had taken off a jacket, and now wished to put it back exactly as they had found it. The lantern last. Eliza held it and rested her chin on the cool brass for a second, absent-mindedly affectionate. At the canyon's first turn, just as the older man had said, a white rock shaped itself as a loaf perched in someone's oven, halfway done. They set the lantern there and stepped away. It looked right. It looked like a long habit being kept. Back at the junction with the cottonwoods, they looked for the man. The shelf was empty in a manner that made it feel occupied by his absence. On the stone where he'd sat, grit had formed a small crescent, where the curve of a boot might have been hours prior. Nothing to prove anything. Everything to suggest it had been true. At the trailhead, a ranger truck parked in the friendly slant that says someone has chosen to be a neighbor. The bulletin board held laminated maps, warnings about weather, and a few faded notices people rarely read with any seriousness. There was also a display that must have been replaced recently. Black and white photographs and short paragraphs about the canyon's history, old trails, and names you learn, and then forget until someone tells you the story again around a table. One of the photographs showed a woman in a brimmed hat holding a lantern very like the one they had borrowed. The caption explained that during a period decades earlier, a local volunteer named Harlan had taken to walking the canyon after sundown, when he suspected hikers had misjudged their daylight. He would stand at certain bends and hold his lantern low, not lecturing, not scolding, simply being present so people could find their way towards safe ground without becoming a lesson in a brochure. It mentioned an accident one year in which he did not return. Not a lurid telling, not a warning shaped like a hook. Just the record of a person and a place that had cared gently for one another. The friends looked at each other, then at the photo, then at the path back to the canyon's first turn. Eliza got into the car and said nothing for a while. The others folded maps, placed boots under seats, removed hats as if to make space for the thought. That night, from a motel with pebbles in the parking lot that a child had arranged into a small star, they saw through the window the distant line of the canyon. On that line, a tiny point of steady light appeared, moved slowly, then paused. It was so far you could miss it if you blinked. It felt as if it belonged more to the stars than to the land. The friends did not try to take a photograph. They watched as if listening with their eyes. The light resumed. It reached a bend and held. It did not want congratulations. It wanted to be useful. In the years that followed, they would think about how certain kindnesses do not end so much as they change their shape to fit where they're needed next. A lantern set on a white rock. A bench reached with dignity. A voice that gives quiet, specific advice and then lets you go your way. Stories don't always ask to be solved. Some ask simply to be repeated, so that the next person who recognizes the shape of the lantern's glow won't be frightened by their gratitude. Story number 4. In the high country, where the air feels like clean linen and sound, travels with an honesty that startles, two friends carried their packs up a steady grade to a small tarn that sat in a circle of stone. The lake was not much larger than a city block. It held the sky like a polished coin. Juniper and crumholtz clung to the ridges like handwriting. The plan had been simple. Saul and Mira would spend 2 nights at the water's edge and walk the rim trail during the day, letting the world become smaller and kinder, with each hour away from service bars and inboxes. They reached the tarn near late afternoon, when sun turns brassy and the shadows relax their shoulders. The campsite they chose was a shelf of flat granite, softened by a scatter of duff, and one obliging patch of grass where a tent could lie as if it belonged. Across the water, on the far side under a notch of rock, another tent door glinted. It was the same humble orange as theirs, a model popular enough to be a coincidence. A pot hung from a stub of branch like a silver bell. The sight of other campers made the place feel more like a neighborhood than a wilderness, and for a moment they felt the gratitude of not being the only 2 people the mountains had asked to stand quietly in its company. Saul raised an arm in hello, palm open, the universal language of, We see you and mean no harm." Across the tarn, a figure stepped out from behind a boulder and lifted their arm too. There was a pause. The gesture seemed to arrive a beat late, as if the other camper had been waiting for a cue. Saul dropped his hand and began setting the tent poles, thinking nothing of it. Sound took longer to cross water, that was all. Light has its own delays too, a mental trick of distance. The brain forgives those little mismatches when it wants things to be simple. They unrolled their sleeping bags, tucked their boots under the vestibule, and gave the stove a small perimeter of stones. The tarn kept a calm face. The wind laid a faint nap on it from west to east. From their angle, you could see where the nap changed direction and where it didn't. Mira poured water for tea and watched steam fold into the cooling air. She glanced up. Far sidearm lifted again, but this time she hadn't moved first. She raised her hand in reply, and the other hand fell an instant later. Same as before. Like watching your reflection carelessly delayed. "It's the distance," Saul said, as if that answered anything. He smiled. The mountains were making them simple in the way they liked. He placed the mugs near their feet. The tea smelled faintly of mint, and a summer that felt sideways to where they were. Twilight turned to a color that belonged only to places without streetlights. Small things inched closer to their evening selves. The first star arrived, then another, and there came a quiet that made room for the kind of talk that doesn't really need words. The inventory of the day, the inventory of the self, laid out and put away with the soft efficiency of people who have known each other a long time. From the other side of the tarn, the metallic note of a pot tapped once. Then, a breath later, their own pot, caught by a small lift of air, answered with its own thin ping. Mira laughed at the luck of the echo. She tapped her spoon against the rim without thinking. Tap. The note became part of the place. On the far side, the other camper's spoon, or a spoon very like it, tapped again. Tap. They went to sleep with the kind of ease that only comes when you've carried the weight of the day on your shoulders and then set it down in a circle of light that feels earned. The night pressed in a friendly way against the nylon. Somewhere, a small watcher, an owl perhaps, rearranged what it knew about the movements of small lives. Wind slid over the tarn and stroked the tent with fingers too soft to wake anyone. Near dawn, when the light was a slow insistence at the edge of the fabric, Mira heard the faint sound of a zipper. Not their tent. Across the water. It was the even burr of fabric teeth parting. Then, a moment later, the same sound above her head as Saul opened their own door. It was small enough to comment on by overthinking, but not small enough to ignore if you were someone who listens for patterns. Mira tucked the thought away with her second sock. They ate breakfast with the neatness of campers who have learned the small satisfactions every wrapper folded, every crumb minded. Across the tarn, two shapes did the same. A raised elbow mirrored Saul's. A knot length on a bear hang rope mirrored Mira's. This was the point at which curiosity stepped in and pulled up a camp chair. "Look," Mira said, trying to keep her voice in that gentle place, not accusing the air of anything. She stood and brushed her hands on her pants. She did not move her arms. Across the water, the other figure stood, brushed their hands, did nothing with their arms. She lifted her right hand to her cap brim. On the far side, the same hand lifted and touched a brim. She twisted her wrist and let the back of her hand flash once in the sunday. The other wrist flashed. It was not perfect. It wasn't the kind of mirroring a magician could sell tickets for, but it was the kind you notice, and then notice again, until your noticing becomes a thing of its own. They hiked the rim trail late in the morning. The ring of stone was not so severe that it required ropes, not so gentle that it allowed a person to forget where their feet were. From several points they looked down on their tarn like a pupil in a pale eye. The far shore was steep, the kind of steep that keeps people honest. There was no easy path to get to that other camp without a detour that would ask the day to be longer than it was. That fact sat in their pockets, warm and humming like a phone that refuses to let you forget it's there. Midday, they returned to the water and slid their boots off, sitting with their feet in the tarn. Sun on stone gives a person the sense that the world has been ironed. Across the water, the other campers' boots sat side by side, laces looped neatly. It should have been charming. It was not quite charming. As the second evening drew itself into place, they decided to test what they had only been nodding at. Nothing elaborate, just small jokes to themselves, the way a person might blink twice at their reflection to see if the reflection is awake. Saul stood and clapped once. There was a beat longer than before, and across the water a clap answered, as if sound had found a corner and turned around. Mira bent and drew a circle on the ground with her finger. A shape bent and drew a circle. She sighed. The sigh did not carry, nor did it to their eyes result in a sigh in return. The world had its limits, even here among politely miraculous things. Night came differently the second time because their attention was now a little sharper, like a knife that has been pulled across a stone one more pass than usual. They kept their headlamps dim, the way people do when they like the feeling of being the kind of animals who once saw in the dark, just enough to find their way. Across the tarn, a beam traced along ground with the same hesitant care. Saul flicked his beam softly in short arcs. The other beam offered short arcs, a hair late, as if it were learning choreography from across a stage. At some hour that had lost its digits, the wind rose without drama, lifted and laid itself down again like a blanket being shaken out. A second wind followed, stronger, with enough voice in it to rub the tent cords until they whispered. Mira propped herself on one elbow, listening the way a person listens for rain when they have left something important outside. The tarn went from glass to a field of muscle. Across the water, the other camp stirred. A figure stepped out and began to secure guy lines, hands practiced, motions economical but not hurried. Saul and Mira were not far behind. Their lines had been decent, but decent had a way of wanting help when a ridge began to mutter. Saul tightened a knot and felt the reassurance of doing the correct thing at the correct time. When he looked up again, the figure across the tarn had moved to a dead snarl of a tree perched half in, half out of the soil. The sort that thinks about leaving even on a mild afternoon. The figure backed away from it, headlamp glancing across the charred underside where lightning had once tasted it. That small flashlight swivel said as clearly as words, "Not here." Mira took this as an instruction. Their tent sat a little inside the drip line of a standing snag nobody could quite condemn without a judge. They dragged the whole pale dome 3 feet to the right, an operation that makes a certain noise that makes the heart want to beat wider. They restaked, retied, took a breath. The wind changed pitch, and from the east, the low hum of air that has traveled across distance arrived in a way that reminded them how small a tent is and how noble it can feel to be inside one anyway. What happened next was not dramatic enough to make a broadcast. The snag over their former spot sighed and tipped a fraction, and then settled, not all the way down, but enough to lay one tired branch across the place where their tent floor had been. It landed with the discourtesy of a heavy thing deciding it's no longer interested in pretending to be light. If they had stayed put, the night would have been louder and clumsier. As it was, the branch scratched a little chorus of apologies across granite, then stopped. In the little quiet that followed, Mira lifted her hand toward the tarn and offered a small formal nod to the other camp the way people sometimes nod at drivers who pause at crosswalks. Across the way, the other figure lifted a hand in the same modest salute. Sleep after a thing like that comes in pieces. They took the pieces and arranged them as best they could. Dream, wake, listen, sleep. It is sometimes the most a person can ask for. Morning reset the lake's face. The snag's branch lay where it had decided to, and its decision was part of the landscape now, as if it had always been there. Over breakfast, they spoke of ordinary things to keep their voices from being recruited by the strangeness. How good the first sip of coffee is when air holds it for a second before releasing it. How satisfying it is when the sun touches your left shoulder at the exact moment you thought, maybe my left shoulder could use Sunday. Across the tarn, the other campers were slow to appear. The tent door remained closed. The silver pot did not lift. The boots waited. Mira raised a hand, palm open, feeling slightly foolish. Nothing answered. They waited. Eventually, and without ceremony, the far tent's zipper whispered down. A figure stepped out. It was not exactly the same outline as before, taller by a little. Or perhaps it was the angle. Or perhaps acknowledges itself. People stand differently in the third morning than they do in the second. They had intended to stay a third night because the place had threaded itself through them in a way that felt kind. But around noon a change came in the weather, not rain, not a plan. Just that sensation a person has when air puts a hand on your chest and says gently, "It might be time to go." The clouds gathered in thoughtful ribs. The tarn's surface stopped being ornamental and became a little more like a work surface. Across the water, the other camp began to pack. Here was the odd part, as if what had come before weren't odd enough. The pacing changed. The other campers folded their tarps, not seconds after Mira and Saul, but a few beats before. They lifted their packs to their shoulders and then set them down again, adjusting straps Mira hadn't thought of yet. They checked the sky and paused, and checked again with a kind of attention that teaches the body a new way to be alert. When the first fingers of rain began to consider the ground not yet falling, only thinking about it, the other camp's figure pointed along the rim toward a notch that a person could take to reach the lower trail that fed out to the parking area. Mira and Saul looked at one another in that quick way people who know each other do when they are asking a question with their eyebrows. Then came the part that made their choice for them. The other headlamp, though it was daylight, clicked on and drew 3 brief arcs in the air, like someone sketching a half-moon 3 times. The pattern repeated. Mira remembered an old hiking book mentioning a simple, almost forgotten signal. Move now. She felt the old story fall through her, like a penny in water. They packed as if they had planned to pack at that very minute all along. No scramble, nothing left messy. The place had been good to them. They would be good to it. As they hoisted their packs, the first raindrops took the decision out of their hands and baptized the straps. Across the tarn, the other camp was already on the move, a few minutes ahead, the figures dark against the stone, small and precise as punctuation. The path they chose low, instead of hugging the exposed rim, put them on the lee side of a line of spruce, just as the storm decided to invest itself. The wind found the rim and tried to play it like the mouth of a bottle, deep and sonorous. On the lower path, the sound was more like cloth. The rain came then, evenly and with purpose, and the world smelled right in the way that freshly wet stone smells right. They placed their boots carefully and spoke less, hearing their steps, hearing their breath, hearing the small encouragements the land gives when you note its contours and agree with them. At a junction sheltered by an overhanging slab, they paused. A small rectangle of laminated paper, nailed to a post with the humility of something that has been repaired more than once, offered a hand-drawn map showing the 2 routes and a box labeled, "In adverse weather, choose low trail." Someone had penciled a more recent note beneath it. "Watch for sudden gusts on ridge. Trees are tired this year." The handwriting was neat, each letter distinct, as if the writer had wanted to be understood by anyone, in any weather. By the time they reached the little pullout that served as a trailhead, the rain had gentled. 2 cars sat sleek and beaded. The map box held a log where people put their names and the times they had entered and exited, the kind of small record that, in many places, is an afterthought, and in a few places, is a matter of love and mathematics. They signed out, hands damp, letters less tidy than they might have liked. Inside the log, beneath names that read like 100 small adventures, someone had written, in the margin, a note that the ink had blurred slightly. "If you camp at the Mirror Tarn, treat both shores as neighbors." Weather and sound can trick you. People make it safer. The signature had been rubbed by a thumb. It could have been J. Alvarez or T. Anders. It could have been anybody. The date was 2 summers ago. Saul, because it felt like the right thing, left a brief thanks on the next line without knowing who it was to. Mira placed the little pencil back exactly where she found it, with the point facing the same direction, because the habit of small care had stayed with her as she walked down out of the wind. They drove the slow gravel that reintroduced them to the idea of roads. The trees dripped off their rain as if sending the water onto some job farther down the hill. A ranger truck puttered in from the other side, an older model with the kind of patient engine that makes no promises and keeps them anyway. The ranger within a person whose face had the look of someone who likes hearing about other people's days, leaned an elbow out and wished them well. They traded the mild formalities of the trailhead. How was the tarn? Are the biting flies earning their pay? Did you hear the coyotes again where they gather near the altar? Mira, surprised by her own eagerness to say it, aloud, asked if anyone else had mentioned the way the opposite shore sometimes seemed. She searched for a word that meant strange without inviting too much theater. Responsive. "Oh, that little lake," the ranger said, like someone remembering a neighbor who once gave them back a borrowed tool without being asked. "Yeah. Sound does funny things there. Heat does funny things. There are stories. A sheep herder used to sit where you probably sat and read the wind off the other side. Said it told him what the ridge was thinking. Never knew how, exactly. Just knew that if the pot knocked twice over there, you waited here and then you'd be glad you did. Folks have tried to make it into more than that. It's enough, I think, that the place knows how to be polite. On the highway, with the mountains stepping back into a blue that made them feel less like walls and more like furniture, they fell into the quiet that comes after a thing you know you'll tell later. At a long bend, the clouds broke in a gap, and sunlight laid a brief, bright finger across the far ridge. Mira looked up into the rearview mirror and almost saw it. A small figure on the far shore, lifting a hand. A simple, ordinary gesture passed across distance. 10 seconds late, or early, depending on whose clock you were using. That night at home, the stove sounded too loud. The refrigerator's modest hum seemed oddly companionable. They found themselves tapping their cups lightly on the counter, listening for an answer. There wasn't one, of course. The kitchen walls are not mountains, but when Mira lay down and closed her eyes, the tarn circle held in her mind like a coin she kept flipping. Heads. She had been watched over by people who were simply doing what they were doing and happened to be aligned with her by weather and luck. Tails. She had walked for 2 days near a place with its own narrow rules, which could be borrowed but not owned. Weeks later, when a friend asked for recommendations on places to camp, she told the story in a voice that made it gentle and left out anything that would make someone think big thoughts late at night and not sleep. There's a lake, she said. If you go, wave at the other shore. And if a pot taps twice across the water, just take a breath and listen. That might be how the place says hello. Or it might be how it says, try the low trail today. Either way, it's good company. As for the far shore, Saul printed a photograph from his phone, not a dramatic one, just the clear surface of a small mountain tarn, with 2 little tents like punctuation marks, in an essay the land had written before they arrived. He pinned it to a corkboard above his desk. In the picture, the reflection of the sky looks brighter than the actual sky, a trick of angles and lenses. If you looked long enough, you could almost convince yourself there was a third tent there in the wash of light where none had stood. You could almost convince yourself that the lake was still patiently holding the shape of 2 people learning to do something together that required no words at all. Story number 5. They found the map in a wire basket at a used bookstore, that kind of basket that sits near the front with things priced by whim and nostalgia. The map was thick paper, creased into obedient squares, its cover soft from years in and out of pockets. On the front, a faded photograph showed a smiling pair in 70s windbreakers beside a footbridge over a creek. Tasha liked that the map had belonged somewhere before. Eli liked that it was paper at all. Their friend Noor, who had always been loyal to satellites and signal bars, shrugged and bought a chocolate bar at the counter, then tucked the old map under her arm anyway, because there's a kindness in humoring old objects. They were planning a loop through a forest that had the shape of a quilt when viewed from above. Patches of cedar, fir, and maple, sewn together by creeks that braided and unbraided themselves with seasonal patience. The loop's halfway point had a small campground marked on their phone download as Hemlock Bench, a raised platform of ground that caught morning sun early and released it late. The forecast was forgiving, the kind of trip that feels like an exhale. They set off when shade still held the road. The trail rose and then eased again, as if it were checking in on their breathing and adjusting itself accordingly. Heavy duff made the sound of their boots polite. Every switchback had a view that made them feel seen by the hills without being watched. By late afternoon they reached a shoulder where the air cooled, and the creek made an articulate sound against stones. They chose a site slightly above the water, close enough to hear it, far enough to allow the creek its privacy. A woodpecker's unhurried work marked the last of the daylight. Eli hung a line. Noor started water for tea, the little stove's whisper folding neatly into the forest's wider hush. Tasha unfolded the map on a flat stump and smoothed it with her palm the way a person calms a sheet on a bed. Under the camp light, the map's blue ink looked a little different than it had at the trailhead. The creek line seemed not so much drawn as laid in threads. She lifted the corner and tilted it. The light slid, and for an instant the blue brightened, then quieted. Heat printed, Noor said, leaning in, or some kind of ink that shows age when you angle it. I read about that once. People used to mark changes with pencils that were almost invisible. Then they'd show up in raking light. Mark changes? Tasha asked. She traced a finger along a symbol for a ford, a little figure of 3 parallel curves crossing the blue. Floods move things, Eli said, pouring tea. Someone cared enough to keep this honest. The ford they meant to use was marked just downstream. They'd cross in the morning, walk the bench, camp in Hemlock, and carry the rest of the loop in good time. Tasha circled the ford with her pencil and wrote, neatly in the margin, Plan A. She placed the map atop her sleeping pad so it wouldn't lift in the night. The edges curled a little with the warm breath of the lantern. In the middle of the night, the creek's voice changed, not danger, just that deeper register water takes on when day's melt has made it fuller. The tense walls breathed in and out with the small confidence of well-tied ropes. When morning arrived and the zipper teeth parted, the world beyond was crisp as a folded napkin. They ate without hurry. The forest asked for that. Tasha folded the map open. Near the circled ford, a faint dotted line she did not recall now, traced a short upstream detour toward a narrower segment of blue. Then back. It had the gentle indecision of something added in pencil by a quiet hand. Did one of you? She began. Noor shook her head. Eli ran a thumb along the paper. We might have missed it. It's faint. They walked down to the advertised crossing. At the usual place, spring runoff made the water pushier than it had promised to be yesterday. Not impossible, just argumentative. Upstream, not far, a log had thrown itself between 2 boulders during some storm, and then decided to remain. Flat stones lay in a shuffle that suggested many feet had paused there over time, placed by someone who wanted strangers to feel less like strangers to the creek. The dotted path on the paper ran true to those rocks. They crossed without theater, the water's push asking respect and receiving it. On the far bank, Noor laughed once, softly, the relief that comes when a choice is proved. The day's walking was ordinary in the best sense. Ferns rose in a collective exhale. Sun found ways to be kind even when filtered through fir and hemlock. They passed a meadow where the ground shone a little with moisture, and decided to remember it if fire season came mean later in the year. In late afternoon, the trail stepped up to Hemlock Bench, and the bench, with the dignity of an old host, stepped up to greet them. The place had received campers before. The evidence was not ugly, just the slight polish where a lot of boots have agreed on what makes a good path from tent to water. They placed their home where it felt square to the world. The stove, the line, the careful triangle of sleeping, eating, storing. While Eli adjusted guy lines, Tasha opened the map to check tomorrow's climb. The tent icon on the paper, a small triangle with a flag that the printer had probably thought clever in a year when people liked cleverness in small things, lay just a little downhill of where they stood close enough as makes no difference. She angled the map toward the light. Across the lower margin, thin words revealed themselves one by one, as if shyness were a kind of ink. Cold air pool here after dusk. Favorite place for fog to practice. She smiled. Listen to this, she said, reading it aloud. Not as a warning, but as the sort of note a neighbor might leave about the way a porch step creaks if you put your full weight on it. They set the tent a few feet higher than the obvious flat. It felt petty at the time, like giving in to a superstition. They ate. They sat quiet. The forest's evening shift workers took their places. When night was full, the cold came. It came like a cat, brushing first the backs of hands, then settling along ground in a smooth layer. Down below them, a faint skin of fog combed itself through the understory. They watched it move around their ankles and then away, present and harmless. Their breath made its own brief ghosts and then was gone. Tasha slept with the folded map under her camp pillow, not on purpose so much as because it had nowhere else to be. At some hour that had no number, she woke and listened to nothing in particular, and that nothingness felt companionable. She slipped the map out and opened it in the tent's small space, the beam of her headlamp limping across it so as not to wake the others. Near a bend in the upper trail, a tiny circle stood she hadn't seen before. Beside it, a printed word she could not discern at first. She angled the light. Look out. Below that, faint again as a breath on glass. Good morning spot, if the rest is fog. She closed the map and tried to put the thought aside as one puts aside a pleasant surprise, so it can be experienced properly when it's time. Dawn made the tent slowly lighter from the bottom up. Outside, fog pressed its face, then wandered off, undecided. They ate, packed, shouldered. The fog came back briefly to say a formal goodbye, then opened the trail like a door. When they came to the bend on the upper path, there it was. A stump with a flat top and a notch like a seat carved by either years of weather or one careful hand. A slot of view where the creek sheeted itself over rocks below, and a long finger of hill pointed, sleepily, toward the day. On the stump sat a tin box with a lid that had been opened and closed so many times the hinge had learned to stop complaining. Someone had written "Look here" in block letters on a strip of tape, and then, at some point, thoughtfully replaced the tape before the first tape failed. Inside, not the sad trash of thoughtless visitors, but a stack of damp-resistant cards and a pencil 5 inches long, sharpened with a knife by someone who knows the contour of a good point. Tasha read the top card. Short notes from people who had passed. Fog banked low today. Walked ridge after it cleared gorgeous. Creek high. Take the upstream log. One card. Older. The pencil's line faint. Read, "If the map found you, be kind to the map. Add what you wish you'd known." JL, 93. They wrote what they wished they'd known. Cold gathers low at Hemlock Bench. Give yourself a few feet, and you'll sleep warmer. Alternate crossing upstream is gentler when the creek has things to say. Eli drew a little emblem of 3 curves and a line, a sketch of the creek and log, the kind of drawing a person's hand remembers after the mind gets out of the way. Noor, who liked satellites but loved people, wrote, "Thank you, whoever you are." The climb that day had a friendliness that rose from knowing, even if it was a fragile knowing, that they were walking in the aftercare of those who had walked before. Midway up, the map showed a spur that their phone map did not. It was not a new trail. It was a winter detour for when ice made the main switchback more ambition than wisdom. In May, the slope was a patchwork of snow that had given up in some spots and held stubbornly in others. They took the spur because the spur asked so politely, and because politeness, like gravity, often has the right of way. Near a small saddle, the air told a different story thin enough to make voice a tool you use with purpose. They stopped. The wind lifted and lowered its hand across the treetops. From the side slope came a change, not a crash, not a sound that seeks to be news, just a roll and a slide, the sort of small rumble that means the mountain is doing chores out of sight. A minute later, down on the main switchback, they saw the tail of where a little parcel of snow had decided, gently, to relocate itself across the path and take some loose stones along. It would have been nothing to climb over. It would have been something to walk into in fog. At camp that night, somewhere beyond the saddle in a clearing ringed with alder, the map felt like a book a person has read 3 times that keeps offering up new sentences, as if to reward rereading. Under the lantern's circle, fainted lines rose like writing in lemon juice shown to a candle. In the lower corner someone had drawn, years ago by the look of it, a little ear with 3 curved lines beside it. Listen here. The ear sat next to a notch marked on the contour where wind would funnel if wind decided to. They put the map aside then, deliberately. They were not ready to be coached through every bending of every branch. They cooked and set the pot aside with care. When the talk turned to families and jobs and whatever new hope had replaced last year's, the forest held their words and gave them back softer. Later, when they had zipped the tent and arranged their small space, the air changed in the manner of a page that anticipates being turned. A single, larger gust moved through the notch, said what it had to say, and left. The tent lines thrummed once like the smallest harp. Noor, awake, traced a fingertip along the ink ear on the map by the last stowaway light from the lantern. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll listen." Morning took its time, and then, as if embarrassed, arrived all at once. They took down the line and shook the mist from it in a fine silver arch. Before they folded the map, Noor reached for the pencil card she'd taken from the tin and wrote, neatly, in the shallow margin along the map's legend, "Wind funnels at the notch. If it speaks, answer by checking your lines." Underneath, Eli added, "Snow moved across the main. The spur was kind." On the second to last day, the loop began to hint at the return, the trail tilting the way a voice does when a story circles back. They walked through a stand of cedar, that made the trail a nave. The light filtered as if passing through water. At a hairpin where the creek came near again, Tasha stopped. On the map, the blue of the creek was open here, then narrowed, then widened, in a way that suggested gravel bars. When she angled the paper, pale hatching appeared across the widest section, like fingers laid lightly over a piano. The printed contour had not included those. Below, a tiny word. Braided. They stepped down to the edge and saw what the map had made them expect. 3 ways to go, all of them correct in their manner, none of them honest about what they would be like 30 feet on. Stones provided as much as they took away. They did not rush. They found a line that set each footfall where it felt like a question could rest, not like an answer that might argue. On the far side, a bare spot in the sun offered a long, flat rock where someone had left a thin strand of blue ribbon under a pebble. On it, hand-printed in fine letters, "For the map." In a little stack beside, others green, red, another blue, each with a note. The oldest of the ribbons was frayed, the ink spread from years of damp and dry. It read, "High water years like to be remembered." They left their own ribbon with a message so ordinary it felt like the right kind of offering. Early June. Water clear to mid-calf, at the shallow. Took upstream stones. We were grateful for the extra patience. Back near cars and asphalt, where the trail loses its accent and speaks in the plain, cheerful voice of civilization, a small ranger station wore a porch and a light over its door. Inside, a volunteer whose sweater matched the color of the map's older ink stood with a clipboard and a pen that had a good spring. She asked the standard questions in a way that made them sound like a neighborly interest rather than paperwork. Any blowdown? Any bear activity? Anything on the loop you'd tell the next folks to expect? Tasha hesitated, then opened the map on the counter. The volunteer leaned in and smiled, as if she'd been shown a photograph of someone she'd known a long time ago. "I've seen a few of these come through," she said. "Old editions. People tend them, not officially. It's more like a quilt, the way a town makes a quilt, one square added by one household, then another by another. Sometimes you can only see the stitching in certain light. It's better that way." "JL?" Noor asked. "Does that name mean anything?" The volunteer nodded toward a corkboard where a faded flyer hung, a copy of a copy. A photograph of a woman with a brimmed hat, holding a map on her knees in the bed of a pickup, laughing at something just outside the frame. "Janet," she said. She loved the loop. She didn't think knowledge had to be a lecture. She thought it could be a polite nudge. Some people say she tapered notes in pencils that would show up when the paper warmed. Some say it's simpler than that oils from our hands, sunlight, dew. Either way, it's never been wrong in a way that got anyone hurt. The volunteer tapped the map's margin, where their new pencil letters sat, not touching, just acknowledging. "You did it right. You wrote like someone you'll be glad to meet later." They left the station lighter than they'd arrived, which is a good way to leave any place. At the trailhead kiosk, where brochures leaned in neat plastic pockets, a metal clip held a sheet of paper that said, in large letters, "Free maps outdated, but still friendly." They could have folded theirs into that stack and walked away. Instead, Tasha folded it and placed it back in her pack. "One more trip," she said. Then we let it go. At home, she pinned the map to her kitchen wall with clothespins across a string. The apartment had the kind of window that gave moonlight a habit, and the moon took advantage of it. On the first night back, sleepless from being back, she made tea and stood in the quiet, listening to the refrigerator practice its one song. The moon through the blinds laid pale ladder rungs across the map. The old blue brightened in those rungs. The tent icon at Hemlock Bench seemed to move, very slightly, like a boat in a gentle harbor, not location, just the suggestion of breath. In the lower right, at the edge of the legend where no one ever writes anything, a new faintness, not yet letters, seemed to wait for a hand. When she visited the loop again late in summer, with her uncle who had always promised to go but never had, she carried the map. She chose moments to hold it under the light the way a person chooses moments to show an old photograph when a story needs a picture. They took the upstream crossing without debate. They sat on the lookout stump and ate crackers when the fog had intentions of staying and then decided not to. Before they left, Tasha took the map to the tin, a box under the notch, and slid it beneath the stack of cards, as if tucking a child in. On the top card she wrote, "Return what you borrowed if you can. If not, Leave it better. Months later, a postcard arrived with no return address, just a picture of the creek in winter with iron rime along its edges like lace. On the back, in a hand that was familiar in the way the map's old lines were familiar, it said, "Your note about the cold pool saved my toes in October. The ear at the notch is still listening. Keep walking soft, Jay. There are scarier tales than a map that behaves like a neighbor. There are louder ones and sharper ones. But in the quiet, when a person is falling asleep and wants only the world to keep being itself when their eyes are closed, there's something about a folded square of paper that remembers what water does and what wind might do, and how feet, placed carefully, become a kind of agreement." The old photograph on the map's cover always showed the same footbridge. The bridge in the forest had long since gone one spring and never come back. The creek solved itself a different way. The map solved itself too, and the next person who takes it home, or finds it at a kiosk, or unfolds it by lantern light and tilts it to watch the blue change the way sky changes at dusk, well, they'll be fine. They'll be better than fine, if they listen. The forest likes people who listen. It always has. Story number 6. They pitched their tents on the lip of a meadow that held the afternoon like a shallow bowl. Lodgepole pines stood just beyond, their tall, straight trunks making a quiet grid against the sky. A creek went about its business along the meadow's far edge, stitching water sound where the grasses bent and lifted. 3 friends, Dana, Kavi, and Ruth, had come in at a slow pace from a trailhead that had seemed friendly even in the early light, sharing the load between them in that way people do when they know each other's strengths, and how to let those strengths breathe. It was late summer, but cool already at that altitude. The sun had a slant to it that made the backs of hands feel noticed. They chose a spot on slightly higher ground, where the wind lifted and laid itself down with the patience of a flag. The tent stakes bit easily. Lines were tied as if hands had been taught by hands. The small stove took its place on stones that looked as though someone had set them there a dozen seasons ago, and each year more people had nodded and said, "Yes, here will do." While the water boiled, Kavi took a handful of dried apples from a bag and looked at the meadow with a pleased concentration, as if he were trying to memorize it in case the place decided to rearrange itself overnight for the sake of variety. Dana unrolled the sleeping pads and tapped them lightly to puff them into shape. Ruth hung a line between 2 trees with that little extra care that keeps things from fussing later when the air shifts. They were not far from other sites. There were signs of careful use here, but close enough to the meadow's edge to make the place feel like they had brought the first chairs to a porch no one had sat on yet. They ate quietly, the way voices naturally soften when there's nothing to push back against. Far away, a hawk wrote a long sentence across the blue, and then decided it had said enough. It began with a small sound, a ceramic note, not sharp, not worried. The clink a mug makes when set on a rock. The 3 looked up as people do when a sound belongs but hasn't been introduced. No one stood nearby. Their own mugs were in their hands. A few seconds passed in the way seconds do when a person expects them to carry more than they can hold. Then, without meaning to create a theater out of it, Kavi set his mug on a flattish stone to reach for the fuel canister. The ceramic ring was the same tone they'd just heard. "Echo," he said, as if that settled it, and in most places it would have. They tidied after dinner the unremarkable ballet of lids and spoons and the polite handling of crumbs, and walked the meadow's edge for a few minutes before night. It was a place humming faintly in a key the ear could feel but not name. A ground squirrel took inventory of them and chose not to file a report. The creek flickered pewter in the long light, its voice more a conversation than a song. Dana stepped around a spot where the grass darkened and she thought, "Left," and then heard it left from a little way ahead, as if her thought had been thrown forward and was bouncing back. It was her own voice, down to the small rasp she got when the air went cool after a hot day. She stopped, smiled without deciding to, and looked at the others. Ruth's eyebrows said, "Did you hear that?" Kavi's shoulders said, "I did." "Okay," Dana said, careful not to make this into something that would require anybody to hold on to it harder than it wanted to be held. Playful place. They tested it without announcing that's what they were doing. Kavi, pleased with his own sense of mischief, said softly, "Banjo," a word that belonged out here exactly as much as any other, which is to say not much. They waited. The wind shifted and made the grasses practice their harmonies. A minute passed. From ahead along the meadow's edge, just where the ground lifted into trees, a thin voice his own said, "Banjo." It wasn't loud, but it landed. They laughed in that way people do when the world has just performed a small trick it doesn't normally bother to perform. They could have made it into a game, and then into a habit. They did not. They returned to the tent with the feeling that they had borrowed a library book with no due date, and still needed to bring it back on time. Night came on in neat layers. Kavi zipped the fly with the slow hand of someone who knows what wakes other people. They lay there listening to things settle. After a while, the zipper sound came again from the dark ahead, the same even burr of nylon teeth. They looked at one another in the dim. "I didn't," Ruth whispered. "Me neither," Dana said, already smiling at how the place seemed to be arranging bits of tomorrow where they could step around them. "It's just us. Out there in 10 minutes. Kavi breathed out through his nose and listened for his breath to come back. It didn't, of course. The place had limits on what it offered. He slept, then didn't, then did. Everyone's favorite sequence. About an hour past the moment when numbers feel like they belong to someone else. They heard it words that arrived round and careful, as if the speaker had felt them first in their own mouth before letting them go. "Please don't." It was not any of their voices. It was not far, and it carried a tone that made it clear the phrase had been meant for someone who would understand it. The three lay very still, and did not ask the dark to repeat itself. Nothing followed. No brush of a body against grass. No additional words to make a context. They listened for a long time in case the phrase had a twin. It didn't. Sleep came back like a shy guest. Dana felt a little ridiculous for lifting one hand under her pillow and keeping it halfway open, as if that would let the phrase pass without catching. Dawn made itself known by laying itself down on the inside of the tent so gently that the nylon had time to think about it before reacting. When they unzipped and sat with their boots in hand, the meadow waited for them without commentary. No footprints but their own, and the delicate marks of the small lives who never sleep all the way. A mist had formed across the lower ground, and then decided to retire when the sun asked politely. Breakfast was short because they wanted to move no nervousness, just a version of curiosity that checks its watch. They broke camp as if the place were watching. Not in a suspicious way, but in the way a host watches to see if guests will remember to fold the blanket and set it where it goes. The trail led them along the meadow's edge, and then into trees. The lodgepoles made a sound like careful broom bristles when the wind threaded them. Beside a downed log, a small wooden stake bore a routing sign burned into it by hand, a little arrow telling winter skiers which way to go when the meadow became an uncomplicated field. Carved into the stake beneath the arrow, in letters the size of a thumbnail, someone had written, "Please don't." Below, a second, lighter hand had added, "Step off." Fragile ground. They stood there with a kind of relief that has the same shape as surprise. The words from the night settled into the stake and made sense in the way a key settles into a lock and finds no resistance. They had been the people being asked to tread kindly at some point slightly ahead, and the place had done what it could to front-load their kindness. They nodded to no one in particular and moved on. If the meadow had been gentle, the next stretch of trail carried them into a stand where the ground underfoot told older stories. Fire had come through years before long enough, now that green had returned in 1,000 small rationalities, short enough that snags reached up like pens mid-sentence. The wind in a burn has a voice all its own. It has the habit of listing and then writing as it moves. They didn't avoid the place. They gave it their attention. Halfway through, the three stopped to drink and looked down into a draw where the creek reappeared without asking permission. Conversation went quiet. From ahead, not far, came the creak and pop of a dead branch adjusting its ambitions. Then, a version of the sound returned from their left, where a similar snag changed its mind about the angle at which it wanted to rest. The woods rehearsed themselves. A minute later, a larger sound returned from the trail ahead, just the timber's throat clearing. Not a call for concern, but the kind of change that makes people count their steps. They moved through the section with a patience that other people might mistake for caution, and were glad to be mistaken. At midday they found an outcrop of rock that made an amphitheater for lunch. The wind did its small work on the sweat along the backs of their necks. They ate without saying much. People forget how many words hunger uses up on its own before you even open your mouth. Later, while they walked, Kavi said out loud, "Apple slices," because that had been lunch. and he was pleased with the continuity of his own thoughts. 10 minutes on, the phrase came back from ahead, his voice tossed forward, and returning like a paper airplane that had decided to be good at flying. "It's an echo that can't be bothered with walls," Ruth said, letting a branch she had lifted swing back gently so it wouldn't whip anyone in the face. "More like a loop." In the mid-afternoon, the trail dipped into a small basin where water had given the ground a memory. A simple plank bridge slipped over the muddier section, the kind of bridge you step on and then, out of habit, step off and look back at as if to say thank you to a thing that has carried you. On the far end, a little sign had once said, "No horses," but the paint had gone, leaving the ghost of letters. Under those ghost letters, somebody had scratched with just enough force to last, "Mind the moss." Dana smiled with her teeth closed, small and genuine. The words, "Please," don't felt less mysterious now, but they hadn't lost their weight. They made camp that evening near a creek, framed by alder and fir, a place where the water had trained the rocks to be round. The clearing was bundled by trees, in a way that made a person feel held. They raised the tent and tied lines. They set the stove on a flat. It was all the same motions as before, but nothing repeats when you do it in a new place. Dana boiled water, and then lifted the pot from the flame with that particular focus that makes steam feel like a live thing you should not surprise. Dusk brought with it the particular hush that makes a nap in the open air so greedy. On the smooth arc of sky above the creek, a first star sat dutifully in its place. They ate. They put their spoons in their pockets without thinking. From ahead along tomorrow's trail, in Dana's voice, came words that made them stand as one unit without consultation. "Stand up now." They stood. Not because they had to be obedient to a novelty, but because the words had carried the tone of someone you trust, saying, "Please." They waited. Nothing dramatic happened. Then a gust arrived, playful and a little out of practice, and the stove's heat blew back on itself. If they had been sitting, the plume would have been in their faces. Standing, it passed their knees. The three of them laughed, not at themselves, but at how good it felt to be bested by a rhythm that wanted no credit. Later, with the cooking done, and the evening arranged in quiet little furniture pieces, mug, boots, rolled map, dark came another phrase, Kavi's voice this time, with less play in it. "Pack's on now." They were not pack on people at night, but they put their shoulders to the straps. They did not cinch them down, but they made themselves ready to be moved. A full minute later, a dead limb somewhere above and behind them decided to be done with its membership in a particular tree and let go. It landed in the small square of ground recently occupied by a rugged patch of moss where they had been sitting cross-legged. The fall wasn't violent. It was the ordinariness of gravity doing what gravity does, but it would have meant bruises and a scold from their bodies in the morning. As it was, the limb bounced once, rolled to the side, and came to rest in a way that made no more noise than it needed to. Now they were paying attention with the kind of focus that doesn't sit in the front row and lean forward. They placed their things a little closer to the tent door than they might have. They listened with interest, but without inviting their hearts to run laps. Near midnight, through the soft rush of the creek and the leaf-on-leaf sounds the wind makes when it has a larger plan elsewhere, came a word that didn't belong to them at all. "Hello?" The voice carried inadequacy in it, a gentleness that asked nothing except to be heard. It was not close. It was also not far. They threaded it into the other sounds and did not pull on it. Ruth laid her hand flat on the tent floor, as if to hold the quiet down in place. The morning was brighter than they expected. That happens in basins sometimes, when the light chooses to arrive all at once, because it is tired of being coy. They followed the trail up toward a low pass where the world on the other side had been waiting with its own light. At the pass, a small cairn sat like a person someone had been interrupted while building. Beneath the top stone, in a little glass jar with a lid that had been unscrewed and screwed forever into a good thread, someone had placed a spiral-bound notebook and a golf pencil with duct tape around it to help it be its best self until the end. The notes inside were the usual and not the weather. The trail condition reports, small kindnesses paid forward. What caught them were two lines, a year apart. The first read, "Heard ourselves singing ahead of us. Sound shelf. Please don't be surprised." The second said in the same hand written later, "Listen well at creek camps. The meadow after the burn likes to send your words ahead so they can wait for you. Not dangerous, just courteous. Below those notes, someone else had drawn a little diagram, a wavy arrow looping around a circle labeled basin. A temperature inversion, the caption read, "If a person liked captions, the kind of thing that ducted noise along the cool air just so, and dropped it where the land wanted to set it down." Ruth traced the loop lightly, not to test the ink, but to make the idea feel more like hers. They wrote nothing, not yet. It felt like one of those times when the most respectful thing is to listen, and then speak later if the place asked. On the other side of the pass, the trail stitched across slopes where the last stubborn snowfields were shriveling into patches that looked like paper that had been folded too many times. They kept an ear out for their own odd future, and for anyone else's past. The voices came and went like friendly birds. They made camp in a tall needled stand, where the ground felt elastic and smelled like 11 different kinds of sap. That night, Kavi fell asleep with his forearm over his eyes, in a gesture he would later remember without meaning to. Dana woke once to the sound of the creek, pretending twice to be farther away than it was. Ruth heard the word careful in her own voice, and placed her boot a little more deliberately on the nighttime walk to the nearby tree. Small things. Courtesy, not warning. The descent the next morning felt like a polite refusal from the mountain you can leave if you wish, it seemed to say. "We'll be here if you want to return." They passed one of those clearings where sunlight has made a practice of laying itself out in a pattern it likes. They stood there for a minute. From ahead, as if they had already said it, came Dana's voice, warm and untheatrical. "You will be fine." A little while later, when the clearing was behind, she said the same words aloud because the loop felt like it should be closed neatly. At the trailhead, the parking lot's pocked asphalt looked like a photograph of a moon. A ranger truck sat there, the door open, a radio making thin, utilitarian comments into the morning. The ranger himself had the rested, alert expression of someone who has learned to love the detail work of a particular place. He asked how the loop had treated them. He asked about blowdowns and water sources and whether there had been much traffic. He asked in a way that made the answers feel like gifts instead of data. When Ruth mentioned the sounds that seemed to travel ahead and come back later, he nodded and tilted his hat away from the sundae. "That basin does that," he said. Night air slides down like a shirt off a line. Sound comes along for the ride and then gets set down where the land feels like keeping it. In the late 80s, a field tech tried to plot it, temperature balloons and all. Got a decent cartoon of it. Then we lost the chart in a move. He didn't offer a ghost to fill in for the lost chart. He only added, with the kind of small satisfaction people have when the world is persnickety and trackable ways, "It's helpful if you let it be." "What about the hello?" Kavi asked. He kept his voice mild, like someone asking where to put a borrowed tool. "People call into that basin from a lot of times," the ranger said, looking toward the line of the pass as if someone he liked were walking down it. "We tell folks not to call back, just in case. If someone needs help, they'll say what help. Most of the time, it's a greeting that doesn't know yet where it's going to land. Best to let it land and not try to make it do tricks." They nodded. The ranger gave them the sort of map people give when they want to make sure you know which roads are closed and which aren't. And they drove away under a sky that had decided to be generous for one more day. At home that night, noises all had their old jobs. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's door clicked in its frame. A dog downstairs announced the mail with more energy than the mail deserved. While she lay in bed, Dana thought of the meadow and the way her own voice had arrived before she needed it. For a long time afterward, when a sentence came to her in a clear shape, and she felt it could be useful if said at once, she said it. Not because of superstition, just because she liked the idea of being the sort of person who would send helpful words into a room a moment ahead of the people who might need to hear them. Months later, a postcard showed up in Kavi's mailbox with a photograph on the front of a winter version of their meadow. The grasses, low, the creek wearing a thin plate of white, the sky shaped like cold breath. On the back, written in neat print, "We heard our laughter ahead, and it made a hard day easier. Thank you to whoever left, you will be fine," in the air. Signed, a family from Site 4. Ruth taped the postcard on the inside of her gear closet door. It looked back at the tent and the lines and the little stove, and made all of it feel included in a very old conversation. The next time they went out, she wrote on the first page of her trip notebook the simplest instruction she had learned all summer. "When the place speaks in your voice, try answering kindly. It's probably you, ahead, asking for a hand. Story number 7. They chose the basin because everyone said the stars there felt closer, as if the sky had lowered itself for a look. A dry lake the size of a small town lay in a shallow bowl fringed by low mountains. In photographs, it was a pale plate, flat enough to make people rethink the word flat, the surface cracked into polygon tiles like old porcelain. Anna, her cousin Theo, and their friend Jay drove in at an hour when heat had softened, and the wind had the generosity to hold off kicking dust. The road ended in a line of tire marks that faded as they spread onto the playa. They picked a place near the eastern edge close to a low rib of rock, far enough from it to give the lake bed its space. The first sensation was quiet. Not absence of sound quiet, but a hush built from 1,000 nothings. Distant insects doing their small math, the faint creak of cooling metal on their car, the odd low pop the playa made as the day's warmth left the ground and the cracked pieces adjusted themselves. They stood for a long minute with their hands on their hips, feeling the way the basin held their silhouettes without judgment. They set the tent with more stakes than seemed necessary because more stakes than necessary is sometimes exactly the number required. The ground was so firm that the stakes did not behave like stakes. They behaved like promises. Jay unrolled the sleeping bags with the care of someone laying out clean linen. Theo set a small stove on 3 flattish stones he found, carefully spaced. Because the surface, for all its solidity, was not a place a person wanted to scorch, Anna paced the circumference of their camp with a rope measure she liked to use, a habit that always made her companions smile at her private rituals. On the rope, she had tied knots at even distances, her own little grid. Out here, the rope felt small and intact, in a way that made her want to be precise. Evening arrived as if walking down from the western ridge with its hands in its pockets. The sky cooled. The cracked tiles took on a milky light. They ate and watched the first stars puncture the deepening blue. It was as good as promised. Nothing stood up to block anything else. And the scale did that thing scale does when it decides to be generous. It made their smallness feel like inclusion rather than dismissal. It began with one point of light, low on the playa, that did not belong to the sky. Anna noticed it first. It wasn't a vehicle. It didn't move with the assertiveness of a headlamp or the steady command of a lantern. It was small and feline, a bead seeming to hang just above the ground far off toward the center of the basin. Then another answered to the left, and a third downline to the right. Not a row, more like 3 points along what might once have been a row. They thought, reflexively, reflectors. But there were no posts here, no signs, not even driftwood. On the far salt you get crystals now and then, Theo said, not presenting an explanation so much as a story the mind could accept. They can flash. Jay swept a headlamp low to test the idea. The first point winked out as if embarrassed at being looked at directly. The others dimmed, then returned when the lamp lowered. A breeze ruffled the tent wall. The beads stayed where they were. For a while, the 3 of them watched with the relaxed curiosity of people who have come to a place for the express purpose of watching. The lights, if that's what they were, did not rearrange themselves into a pattern that demanded attention. But if a person drew lines between them mentally and then looked away, more little glints appeared along imagined lines, as if a faint grid had decided to be noticed only in the corner of the eye. Survey, Anna said, and then wondered why she'd chosen that word. They slept early because the basin suggested early. Night set its lid. Every now and then the playa gave a low percussive thunk, like a drum down a hallway. The tent made its soft tent noises. In sleep, then wake, then sleep. The basin showed them its other habit. Sound traveled strangely. A whisper of grit slid along the outside of the tent, accompanied by the tiniest chime as a single grain flicked the metal of a stake. The stove clicked as it cooled. From out across the lake came a thin, ticking sound at intervals too spaced to be a machine-like tile cracking under frost. Only the air was mild. They accepted it as part of the vocabulary here. No reason to have every noun defined. Near two, the wind finally got to have its say. It moved across the basin as if the whole place were an instrument it had been practicing. The tent lines kept their tune. Sand never rose in a storming curtain the way it does in movies. Instead, a fine powder lifted and ran low, a whisper that wanted to keep its speed. The 3 woke enough to agree silently that the lines were good, the stakes doing their job. They slept again with their bodies slightly arranged, as if to help the tent hold. At dawn, the grid made itself known the way polite things do. Not flaunted, not hidden. When the sun was just high enough to lay a level sheet of light across the playa, little pale squares appeared in the distance, fainter than shadows, brighter than the plain ground. They were not squares, not perfectly, but they were regular in a way nature rarely bothers to be. Each creature of brightness seemed about the size of a small room, spaced evenly from its neighbors, a dot to dot a person could trace if they were patient and had a pen long enough. They walked toward them with mugs in hand, because coffee invites walking. The nearer they came, the less there was to see. Up close, the squares resolved into areas where the texture changed a hair. Salt crust had worn differently, perhaps because it had once been covered by something briefly, long ago, or because the windcloth had snagged here more often, or because when the lake had been lake, the water eddied in a tiny pattern that outlived itself. Lines were suggested, then lost, then suggested again as the light shifted minute by minute. "Your grid," Jay said to Anna. He smiled. "Bigger. It makes me feel sane," she said, and meant it. The plan was simple. Spend a second night, then leave by the northern track and circle around to a ridge with a view over the whole basin. They'd seen a note online that said something about a calibration field the Air Guard had once used somewhere in the county targets, laid out in patterns for aircraft to practice on and cameras to test. No one could say if that had been on this playa or the next one over. In these kinds of places, stories travel laterally and settle where they like. Late afternoon, clouds gathered around the western range in the way that makes a person check the calendar and remember that seasons change whether you're ready or not. The wind lifted and lowered, testing edges. Out toward the center of the basin, the little near-ground lights began to show again. Not points now, but glances, as if the ground had decided to see how much light it could borrow from the low sun and throw back. Anna squinted until the picture became a painting. They were less like stars and more like the glint of glass in sand. She thought about the old calibration story and envisioned white cloth panels pegged in a neat array, someone in a truck aligning them with a transit, the crew joking, with the patience of good work done in heat. They ate early, food tasting more than itself after a day of air. When evening took that decisive half-step toward night, the wind went from suggestion to sentence. Dust did what dust does in basins. It did not form a wall. It formed lanes and sheets. From somewhere behind the low rock rib, a gentler current made a lee that did not look like much until you stepped into it and felt your body release the breath it had been holding on behalf of the tent fabric. That was when the grid, if it was a grid, changed. Lines that ran more or less east-west stiffened into something like intent. They drew themselves closer to the camp, not as a charge, not a caution, but like a walkway rolled out. Little low glints appeared along a path that, if you stood where they stood, arced smoothly toward the rib. Along a second path, a parallel arc toward a slighter depression that might, in a different mood, hold puddles if given a chance. The three of them did not make a decision so much as enact the one the air had already made. They stowed the stove, zipped the tent, lifted what was loose, and walked their bodies and then their gear along the brighter arc toward the rib. As they moved, the ground played its small music under their boots, hollow over some cracks, solid over others. The path of glints held. When Theo paused and turned his head, another arc, 10 yards left, flashed once and then faded, an option acknowledged and then withdrawn. In the lee of the rocks, the wind lowered its voice. Dust streamed on the far side like a creek they were standing beside rather than in. They set the tent down and, with a speed that was mostly calm and only a little practiced worry, restaked. The stakes went in with less argument. The guy lines took a better line. The rib made a note of their presence and absorbed it. They stood in the narrow quiet, while the basin in front of them made itself into weather. If there is fear in a moment like that, it has a muted kind, no drama, just a narrowing of the world to immediate companionship and how your hands move. Inside the tent, the outside surfaced itself as a soundscape, a wide hissing layered with the tap of dust against the windward panel. The grid's glints were out of sight now. Aina sat with her back against her sleeping bag and let the fabric's slight tremor map itself to her spine. Jay, whose mother had taught him certain quiet breath exercises when he was young, breathed in a way that made the space smaller in a good way. Theo, who rarely stopped doing math even when asleep, counted seconds between gusts and gave up when the basin refused to standardize itself. It did not last long, not like the stories people in other places tell where storms go on as if they're being paid by the hour. The wind made its point. The dust managed to reorganize a thin skin of the playa, and then was satisfied. When the worst of it had gone past, the tent resumed its gentler habits. They slept in the way that makes next morning's coffee taste like a secret redeemed. Dawn wrote the basin back in a few strokes. The rib gave shape to the quiet. Out on the playa, the pale squares were more distinct than they had been before, as if the dust in passing had highlighted boundaries. Some of the squares lay softly shaded, where a film of fines had settled. Others were wiped cleaner, a slightly brighter crust. If a person were inclined to make patterns, and human eyes are inclined, they would say the dust had emphasized lines leading from where the tent had first been to where it now was, as if the ground had approved the move and drawn a version of it to remember. A few paces beyond the rib, half-bedded in the fine crust, Anna found a small stamped tin tag the size of a postage stamp. The edges had been softened by time. She brushed it with a thumb, the salt making her skin feel a little squeaky. The tag held letters and numbers. Cal T-17. Beneath, a second line that might have been a date had surrendered to years. She did not pocket it. Without ceremony, she set it back as if it were lunch, and she'd decided she wasn't hungry after all. Theo knelt, looked at the ground around it, and saw nothing else a person could count except cracks in clay. They took a small walk out into the old array. There were no poles, no wires, nothing to point a camera at to convince a skeptic who hadn't been there. But if you stood at a certain place and turned slowly, here and there a glint occurred again near the ground where a crystal of salt lay at just the right angle to the sun and the haze. They noted where they could. Noted and let it go, because not everything wants to be converted nicely into a list. The plan to spend a second night became more flexible when noon built its white house above the basin and thin bands of weather teased the western rim. The clouds were not large. They were convincing anyway. Theo, who had grown up with a father who once got a truck stuck in a different basin for a long afternoon while water made a mirror under the tires, did not need to be told that a little rain at the wrong time makes playa into porridge. The three of them walked the light line with their eyes and found it settled on leave sooner. They took down the tent without haste and with no wasted motion. The wind did not argue. The car looked more itself than it had in the twilight when they arrived. Dust now pressed into every seam. They could see their earlier tracks faint across the playa toward the eastern edge. Between those faint marks, and where the clouds might decide to come, a new thought rose. You can make your own luck. And you can also let luck make you. They started the engine with that tone people use when they agree with a decision someone else made a minute ago on their behalf. As they rolled out, those near-ground glints made one last private comment. They clustered ahead along the path that led toward the busiest of the many faint exit lines leading to the northern ramp. The cluster was not arrow-like. It was not command. It was a density, a faint thickening, as if the ground had learned where tires behave best and wanted to share. They followed without declaring that's what they were doing. The wheels hummed. The edges of polygon tiles marched past, consistently inconsistent. At the ramp, the surface tilted, pleased to be something other than flat for a minute. They climbed the low bank onto the track that wore the story of many seasons and many careful tires. At the top, a weathered sign wood burned. The way people mark information in places where paint fails told a history without making a lecture of it. Aerial survey calibration field used intermittently 1,964. 1,978. Do not drive off designated routes in wet conditions. Below, in smaller letters added later by a hand that had copied the tone of the first. The playa holds what you give it. At the little BLM station miles down and out of the basin, a woman behind the counter wore a pendant shaped like the basin itself, as if the outline of that shallow bowl were something a person could put against their chest and carry. She asked how the road had been, and if the dust had come up like some years. She had the face of someone who has listened to many versions of the same story, with genuine interest each time. When Anna mentioned the faint grid and the low lights, the woman's eyes acknowledged a familiar tune. There used to be cloth panels pegged out there, she said. Big as doors, some of them. White squares and circles on a plan you can still find if you know who to ask. The panels blew away eventually, or were taken up when the programs changed. But once a place is measured with care, it keeps a memory of being seen that way. The salt grows a certain way. People notice, in certain light. We've had pilots come through decades later and swear they can still sight the old runs by how the brightness lines up. And the glints? Jay asked. He gestured low with his hand, indicating height off the ground. She smiled. Crystals. The top layer, when it's just so, will facet and catch low sun across a long line. If the air is dusty, it makes a lens. Not always. But when it does, it can feel very organized. The word organized was kind and satisfying. It carried none of the weight of something ominous and all of the reassurance of something purposeful. On the drive toward the ridge that gave them the long view, rain lifted a curtain along the western range and dropped it in measured swaths across the basin. From up on the side road, they could see it happen, pale smears of water moving like hands smoothing a blanket. The playa took it and darkened in patches and then in sheets. Near where they had camped the first night, the surface gleamed. Their old tracks, what was left of them, softened and then vanished. A truck out in the middle, having come across later than they had, made a careful, unhurried turn and found the packed line. You could almost see the driver's relief at joining the path everyone's tires had agreed on. That night at a campground beyond the ridge pine and duff, the ordinary sweetness of water running in a ditch sleep landed with less ceremony. The wind here had a different voice. The tent wanted fewer knots. They lay in their bags and let backs remember the firm kindness of a flat place, even as shoulders welcomed a little slope. When Anna closed her eyes, she saw the grid in reverse, dark on light in the day, light on dark at night, and felt a small, quick beat of gratitude for the way the world sometimes provides an underline in the exact place the sentence needs one. Months later, when work had wrapped around the hush of the basin and made its own pattern of days, a thin envelope arrived at Jay's with a return address typed in careful letters: County Historical Society, Basin Range District. Inside, a photocopy of an old aerial image, the basin rendered in gray. On top of the playa, faint squares and circles lay in a neat pattern like biscuits set to bake. A grease pencil X marked the area where someone decades ago had written T17. The note clipped to the copy said, in a hand that was tidy without being fussy, "Your inquiry came at a good time. We were rehousing some of the old film. Calibration target array, phase 2. Summer 1967. The panels were pegged to the lake bed with wooden stakes and sandbags. You can still find a tag now and then. Please leave them where they lie." The three met for coffee at a small table, in a place that had chosen to keep some of its chairs mismatched on purpose. They spread the image and leaned in, their heads together. The photograph was not miraculous. It did not turn their experience into proof for anyone else, but it put a square around the feeling they'd had when the lights lined up just enough to guide, that someone had once laid a grid with care, and the place, having found the courtesy pleasant, had decided to remember it in ways only certain eyes at certain hours could see. And when Anna camped alone later that fall in a different wide place, nothing like a playa, a prairie this time that shuffled under a sky that always looked like it was thinking ahead, she stood at twilight and felt the faint prickle a person feels when something in the ground hints at pattern. A line of old fence posts ran a mile, each leaning as if tired in the same direction. She angled her head and saw, just for a second, the way the past lays translucent squares on the present, and how sometimes that's all the map you need to get out of weather and into morning. She set her tent where it would do the least harm. She trusted the voices the place made without asking it to explain itself. When the dew lifted, not quite a grid, more like a suggestion of a grid, shone in the grass. It was enough to be guided by suggestion. Not all warnings have to raise their voice. Not all help has to wear a badge. Out in those wide-lidded places, implication is sometimes the clearest kind of truth. Story number 8. They reached the backcountry site late enough in the day that the light had turned agreeable, and the shadows of the oaks stretched like long dogs at their owner's feet. The site was called Raven Ledge on the map and had been called that for so long that the name felt like bark part of the tree, not painted on it. A stone staircase, wide and sure, walked down from the camp to a creek that had practiced being a creek even before people built the steps. The staircase was an old one, CCC work. The volunteer at the trailhead had said laid by hands that seemed to understand both stone and the way feet like to learn stone. Olivia and Tom set their tent on the flattest patch just beyond a ring of laurel. Old work had passed this way. A low, curved wall held the uphill side of the pad, the way a quiet friend holds a secret. They carried a line between two trees, checked the sky, and then stood for a while with their hands on their hips, just listening to the creek make its vowel sounds. A small sign nailed to a post at the top of the steps read, in old paint, "Water 146 steps." The number, oddly specific, gave them something to smile at. Tom looked at his boots, looked at the sign again, and said, "We'll test their math." The staircase was the kind of work that makes a person slow down, because the work has slowed down for them. The stones were not uniform. Some were broad, some narrow. Some had cups worn into them, where countless heels had chosen the same rectangle of comfort. Moss took the north edges, dry and velvety. Lichen wrote its patient ciphers. Every 10th step or so, a tiny brass tack the size of a fingernail head glinted, just the suggestion of a marker set there long ago. Half sunk now, half forgotten. At a certain step, a small 38 had been carved in by a pocket knife, the digits shy, easily missed unless you were looking for something to find. 38, Olivia said, tapping the carved number with the tip of her finger. I wonder who needed to remember that. They counted. Because you do when a sign asks you to. They counted softly, like people who don't want to wake a napping child. At the bottom, where the last broad stone kissed sand, and the creek ran clear over smooth cobble, they compared notes. I got 147, Tom said, a little sheepish, though there was no pride in being right or wrong. 145, Olivia said, and they laughed. Either the sign lied, or they counted like people on different days. They filled their bottles from a pool where the water laid its surface against the rock like a piece of cellophane. Upstream, the creek slipped through a natural constriction, then loosened its shoulders and went around a bend where laurel branches knit themselves into a tunnel. Downstream, a heap of old timbers made a low shadow across one bank, a relic of some footbridge that had moved on after a flood and left behind only the parts too stubborn to travel. Back at the top, the little painted number on the post watched them consider quiet equations and go on with their afternoon. They ate as the temperature eased. The forest made the kinds of noises a person's ears file under. Everything is in its place. The click of an insect gymnastics routine. A small thump, as some squirrel mistook a thin branch for a thick one, and then corrected its own math. The stone staircase grew darker as the sky went blue-gray under the trees. When they moved around camp, the steps waited in their steady, calm way, a slice of human intention laid down the hill to the water. Night is different in a gorge. It arrives by invitation from the sides, like guests entering a room from two doors at once. Olivia zipped the tent without hurry. Tom placed the two mugs upside down on a rock. The creek kept talking. It began with an acorn falling somewhere in the upper branches, then another, then a third. Each fell in idiosyncratic time, the way a kitchen tap drips when someone hasn't quite closed it. One of them struck the edge of a step. The sound was clean and small, not a warning, just a note. Talk. A minute. Two. Another. In a different place. Tick. The wind had come from the west all day, and now it had gone to make its case somewhere else, leaving the trees to their slow arithmetic. For reasons they could not explain, the acorns made Olivia feel as if the staircase were saying its own name, a syllable at a time. They dozed, woke, turned over, slept. At a point when night no longer clung to numbers, the creek wore a deeper voice, not urgent, only older. Somewhere far upriver, as far as a person's thoughts reach when they ask how far rain may have found a slope, the sound folded into the sound that had already been there, and the sum was still just creek. Olivia lifted her head once when a stray breeze decided to test the tent line without malice. It hummed softly and then forgot its own tune. Near what might have been 2 in the morning, the tent glowed faintly in a green way, not brightness exactly, more an impression that the dark had chosen a different suit. She clicked her headlamp instinctively, and then remembered where she was and turned it off again, letting her pupils do the old work. Through the open mesh at the tent's top, she could see the high edges of the oaks knit less tightly than the laurel down near the creek. The faint green held. Curiosity is not the same as anxiety. She sat up, careful not to wake Tom, and listened. The creek kept its consonants. The acorns had finished their shift. She unzipped quietly and stepped into the cool. The green deepened near the edge of the steps. She crouched and saw it then. At the margins of a few old, half-rotten timbers that lined the uppermost run little shims, set long ago as levelers between stone, a thin seam of foxfire glowed. Not bright, nothing stage-worthy, a quiet little bioluminescent breath, where fungus had chosen to do its own slow work of housekeeping. She'd read about it somewhere, long ago, a science magazine on a dentist's waiting table. Foxfire. The nickname had made it sound tricksterish then. Here, it looked more like the glow under a sleeping animal's ribcage when you know it is breathing because of the motion, not the sound. She smiled, and let herself enjoy the smallness of the spectacle. What unsettled her, but in a way that made her careful rather than frightened, was how the glow seemed to pick out the edges of a stair that wasn't there. Just at the top landing, where the old timbers sat proud of the stone by a finger's width, the luminescence traced a clean horizontal line from one side to the other. During daylight, the line would have been nothing a grin in wood grain, a stain. In the green-soaked dark, it suggested a step. An extra one. A 19th first step, or a 0th. She could almost convince herself that if she put her foot down, you would hear that small, sure toe-heel sound of stone and shoe meeting for the first time. She did not test it. She is the sort of person who sees a surface and imagines how it might behave if it chose to surprise her. She let the idea be an idea. She peered downward along the staircase. The glow appeared again 3 or 4 steps lower in another brace, and again further. Not a perfect line. Not a guide. A staccato. As if the steps were remembering their own edges. When she turned back toward camp, she saw that Tom had sat up, warm light from the tent's small lantern making his outline soft. He raised an eyebrow in the universal language for, "What is that?" And she answered with a palm, and I don't know that included, "We're fine." He stepped out a minute later, bare feet on the flat, and together they stood at the top and watched the staircase breathe. "I got 147, he said quietly, as if the number belonged to the glow as much as to their earlier counting. "I got 145, she said. They let the numerical disagreement be a kind of company. They went back in, lay down, and the night shifted from its green habit to gray without ceremony. Near dawn, the creek's voice pressed a little harder. Not angry, just busy. Rained somewhere some time ago, meeting gravity's good argument. They woke fully when light made the tent a very pale peach. The air had a sweetness particular to mornings after distant rain. The forest's breath was a little cooled, a little gathered. The painted sign at the top watched them with its 146 and said nothing. They walked down, counting again because people are loyal to numbers once they've begun. 146 for him this time. 146 for her. And they looked at each other like two children, who'd finally seen the adult do the card trick twice. At the bottom, the last step was darkened by wet a foot higher up its face than it had been the evening before. The sand beyond was combed in a fresh pattern. A faint waterline ringed the base of a boulder. The line scalloped the way a pastry edge is scalloped by someone who enjoys the patience of small work. The creek had risen and made a statement, and then stepped back in the night. They filled bottles and watched foam cluster along a seam of current, and then break into dots and go their separate ways. Behind the timbers along the upper runs, pale scrapings in the wood showed where fungus had been scraped by something a boot, or perhaps trimmed by a volunteer's knife months before to keep the edges tidy. The glow was gone, day having politely taken its turn. Breakfast tasted more like breakfast than usual. Coffee does that in gorges. They checked lines, tightened what wanted tightening, and went about the little rituals that make a place feel briefly like a home you'll be remembering in the way your shoulders relax at a certain smell for years afterward. They took a day hike upstream along the Laurel Tunnel and found a second set of steps cut rougher into a natural outcrop, water dripping off the lip in a thin sheet, the exact width of someone's memory. The trail climbed to a bench with a view of the creek split in two, where a rock insisted on its existence. At a logbook under a flat stone, they read a few notes left by others this season. Fog sits low until 9. The left fork holds trout small as fingers. Beware yellow jackets near mile 3. And on the last page, in a hand that had practiced neatness without fuss, this: if the steps miscount you at Raven Ledge, take one more before you think you should. They copied the note into their minds and walked back, appetite packed in the front pockets of their thoughts. Late afternoon, a young ranger stepped into camp, as if not to interrupt any sentence they might be having, even with themselves. Her uniform had scuffs that suggested she did more than look official. She checked permits with a politeness that made the bureaucratic ritual feel like neighborliness. When Olivia mentioned the glow on the stair edges, the ranger's face did the thing local faces do around certain stories, a quick recognition, a weighing of how to describe something without selling it. "Foxfire," she said, nodding toward the staircase. "Sometimes the old logs hum at night if it's damp enough." The CCC braced some of the runs with oak long before the blight came through, and the remnants still sit in those gaps. The fungus likes it when air moves and the creek's up. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes it will tease people by making it look like an extra tread at the top. Folks around here call it the borrowed step. "The borrowed step," Tom repeated, trying out the phrase like a pebble in his palm to see if it fit. The ranger smiled. "A few years back, we had a scheduled release from the reservoir upstream. We post it, but not everyone knows what that means. People still camped here anyway, and the water came up just enough to make the last bit loud. The next morning, someone wrote in the trail register that the glow had made them climb one more step, and it made all the difference in how wet their boots were. Then it was a thing. Totally explainable fungus and damp wood, and how eyes behave in the dark, but it's earned the right to be an old story now." She didn't flinch the story into metaphor, or tuck it into a drawer labeled ghosts. She left it bare and sturdy the way a good staircase feels beneath the foot. She asked about blowdowns then, and about the Laurel's height near mile 3, and whether the Yellow Jackets were still home at the rotten stump by the bend. Work? Daily? Ordinary? Kindness. Evening found them again. The staircase looked the same and also not at all the same, because light has opinions. They ate early. Acorns resumed their shy punctuation, here and there. When the little green arrived a softer hue this time, Olivia and Tom watched from their sleeping bags with the fly pulled back to make a frame. The glow was fainter, the air was drier, but it wrote itself in along the same small edges, a cursive that didn't care whether anyone was reading. They fell asleep, and when they woke it was hard to say how much later the night was carrying a larger, more organized sound. Not the resinous hush of the trees, not the creek's continuous narrative. A low knock, measured, at distance, tap, tap, tap. You wouldn't call it knocking. Not exactly. More like 2 round stones greeting each other underwater every 30 seconds. When a slow pulse of current rounded a bend and had to decide how to behave. Their hearts did not race. Their minds did not sprint ahead. They listened and let the rhythm become part of the forest's palette. In the morning they counted again on the way down, not to be proven right, but to examine the feeling of repeated attention. 146. They smiled because sometimes the world likes to practice being consistent in front of you. At step 38 again, that carved number like a signature, they paused and read the grain of the wood where a brace slotted between stones. Tiny new scratches glinted where someone, likely a volunteer, had shaved the rot months before to keep the water flowing clean out rather than pooling. If the glow came, it would ride along that cut. A careful person, hunting for reasons to be comforted, could be soothed by the idea that people had tended the staircase as if it were a neighbor. Down at the water, the line of damp had retreated another inch. Foam had fled. Sand wore the fresh embroidery of insects. On the far bank, among the laurel, a small wooden stake had been pounded flush with the ground, the top painted blue, and a number stenciled, 3. In flood years, the staff gauge downriver wore its own increments. Someone had made a modest, unboastful version here. If you took the time, you could read the creek like a person reads a friend's mood from their breathing. On their last afternoon, as light slid sideways around the trunks and the staircase held its private calculations, they wrote the kind of note that belongs in a place like that. On the back of their permit, in a corner where it would not be read unless someone wanted to read it, Olivia penciled, "Borrow the extra step. Leave it for the next person." Tom added, "If acorns count for you at night, they're only being polite. Listen kindly." They placed the permit under the flat stone at the upstream lookout where the other notes lived and added a clean, sharpened stub of pencil, wrapped at one end with a bit of tape so it wouldn't disappear into someone's pocket by accident. It felt right to leave a tool that had 2 jobs, writing and reminding. On the walkout, the trail climbed and then set them gently down the other side, into a different valley where the creek lacked stairs and chose its own, older path. The forest widened. The air took on a broader vowel. When the ranger station appeared a small square house with windows that liked to have their curtains open, they stopped to hand in what they needed to hand in, and to trade in the ordinary reports that connect people to places even when they've already left them. Behind the counter, an older man wore a pair of magnifying spectacles pushed up on his forehead, as if he had been repairing a thing with tiny parts. He asked about Raven Ledge with a tone people save for cousins they haven't seen in a while. When they mentioned the borrowed step, he nodded in that half-impressed, half-amused way of someone who is happy the place keeps performing its old theater. "My granddad helped lay those stairs," he said, not as a claim to glory but as a fact a person lays on a table with a cup of tea. Said the foreman taught them to float certain pieces of wood in between stones on purpose. Let them swell, let them shrink, you know? So the steps wouldn't heave funny when freeze came. People think of stairs as one thing, but those are a whole lot of cooperation. Fungus just found a nice place to set a lamp, now and then. Aid. He tapped a laminated map where the stairs were marked by a tiny ladder icon the cartographer must have drawn for themselves with a smile. "There's a story folks tell," he added, "that in flood years the steps borrow a rung or two from the night, so the numbers work out right for people who like to count. Never minded it. We do what we can. The place does what it can. Between us, it keeps most folks dry." They drove out under clouds that arranged themselves like folded blankets. The road made its careful turns. The creek kept to the left for a while, then the right. When they reached a long, straight stretch, a run of telephone poles climbed a hill and turned into a line of diminutive stick figures against sky. Olivia rested her forehead briefly against the cool of the window and saw not the poles, but the borrowed glow along a wood edge that had turned nothing into something for just long enough to make sense. At home, a week later, she found a smudge of creek sand on the bottom of her backpack and chose not to brush it away. Tom, without deciding to, began counting stairs at work when he took the long climb to the third floor, not to tally anything, just to notice. Sometimes, when rain drummed on his apartment's roof hard enough to make him think of upstream places, he whispered to himself, "One more step then," as if the staircase at Raven Ledge lived not in the gorge but in a pocket of his coat. A month passed. At the bottom of a brown paper bag of apples, they found a single acorn that must have hitched a ride in a fold of fabric or a cuff. It made the same small weight in the palm that calls to mind numbers and stone, and the idea that places, in their way, keep count of us kindly too. They set the acorn on the windowsill and left it there until winter light thinned, and it seemed right to take it back out on a walk and set it beneath a young oak that was doing its own math as best it could. In spring, someone new read the notes under the flat stone. A family stood at the top of Raven Ledge and saw, on a damp night, the first shy line of green along an old brace. They laughed softly and moved a little higher and slept well. The staircase, which had been made by people who understood how to make 1,000 small agreements add up to a big one, did what it had always done, offered what it could, when it could, and let the creek have the last word.